special guest is the famous author, Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien. Good afternoon, Mr. Tolkien.
Good afternoon, Phyllis.
Well, Mr. Tolkien, probably one of your most famous works is your trilogy, Lord of the Rings. What inspired you to write this?
Well, you see, Phyllis, after I wrote The Hobbit, which was a children's book, I wanted to challenge myself to write a long, enduring novel that would be good for adults. So I started The Lord of the Rings.
I see. Well, I know you're very well known for the symbols that you use throughout your books. Let's talk about those for a minute. Where, for example, what does Middle-earth represent?
Well, actually, Middle-earth represents a time before evil that God had the world created. In this story, it is the evil man Sauron is a form of the devil, and he invades the pure earth. And it is from our earth. It's not another planet or far off.
Oh. Well, how about some of your critics have called Frodo a form of Christ. Is this true?
Yes, in a manner it is. He symbolizes Christ by destroying evil.
I see. Well, how about, say, Gandalf?
Gandalf is like an angel, one of the high angels, of course.
I see. Well, rumor has it that you at first did not want to submit Lord of the Rings to the publisher. Is it so?
Yes, I thought many adults would not enjoy reading Lord of the Rings because it was very long and had very much detail described in it. But my friends from a group called the Inklings that was at Oxford University encouraged me to do so.
Well, and we're very glad that they did. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Now, your parents died when you were very young, and how did that affect your life?
Actually, it didn't affect my life very, very much. I was very young when they died, and I didn't know much the difference. And I was raised by a priest, Father Murphy, and it was just like a normal, happy childhood.
Oh, that's nice. Well, let's turn now to our audience for some questions for Mr. Tolkien. Hi, how are you?
High five!
Oh, you stand up here. Hi. Oh, that's fun. What's your name?
My name is Mrs. Angie Smith.
And Mrs. Smith, what's your question for Mr. Tolkien?
Well, Mr. Tolkien, I always kind of wondered what the J.R.R. in your name stood for.
Well, Mrs. Smith, in answer to your question, J.R.R. Tolkien stands for John Ronald Reuel.
And I have another question I'd like to ask you, Mr. Tolkien. I'd like to know what first inspired you and encouraged you to go on with your writing.
Actually, Mrs. Smith, I was never very interested in writing. What I was really interested in was languages, especially Welsh. And by creating my own languages, I formed a mythology around that and formed a whole book, as you know, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Smith.
Okay.
Oh, let's see. Do we have any other questions? Oh, sir. And what is your name, please?
James R. Morton.
Well, Mr. Morton, and what is your question for Mr. Tolkien?
Mr. Tolkien, are any of the characters in your books patterned after your own life?
Well, actually, Mr. Morton, I have been known to be a mixture between Bilbo Baggins and Gandalf himself.
How come you're like those two? Can you expand on that a little bit and tell me a little bit more about you?
Well, Mr. Morton, you see, Bilbo is rather lazy, like all hobbits. They like to sit back in their cozy little holes and put off things. I'm kind of like that, by not wanting to finish things, but just keep on cooling over. And Gandalf has great wisdom, and I've been known to have good judgments and great wisdom on many matters. And so, in that, likewise, I'm like him.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back with more of the Phyllis Donahue Show right after these commercials. Jordan, that's the shoe that Billy do when he was born.
Nike Air Jordan. That's the shoe. Let Billy do what he was born to do.
Maybe so, but that's not all. Let Laura play like she's 10 feet tall.
For the moves that never fail, Converse is the choice of Dave McHale.
The same is true for Jude Aguirre. When I wear Nikes, I'm on fire.
What can the pure pony do for King? I can do just about anything.
Well, you already know what they did for me.
What?
I walked away with the MVP.
Ah.
Welcome back to the Phyllis Donahue Show. Our guest today is Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien. Let's go to our audience for a few more questions. Ma'am, do you have a question for Mr. Tolkien?
Oh, yeah. My name is Margaret Mead, and I was just wondering if Mr. Tolkien is married.
Well, that's an interesting story. When I was young, as you might say, I met a lady who I was certain I was going to marry. But because of our religions, we had to split up. Their family wouldn't let her see me. Later in my life, I just kept on working and working so I could come back and marry her. Finally, after getting great honors at Oxford, I went back to her and married her.
Well, that's wonderful, Mr. Tolkien. Do you have any children?
Yes, I have 3. Christopher is my youngest.
And do you have a question, sir?
Yes. My name is Morton R. James, and I would like to know what is the Shire and what caused you to create that, or what made you think about that?
Well, Mr. James, the Shire is a big part of Middle-earth where, well, actually it's a smaller quantity of the big Middle-earth, where a group of hobbits live. Hobbits is what Bilbo Baggins and Frodo Baggins are, and they are a breed that aren't seen by many men. And I got this idea from when I was little. I lived in a beautiful village called Sarhol, where there was trees and hills and all over, and it just made me think of a peaceful place, which later became the Shire.
Mr. Tolkien, did your participation in World War I have any effect on your writing?
Well, actually, I don't think so. I tried not to make it like anything like World War I was. But as many of my friends have commented, I guess that I have written about how it was in the trenches when Frodo and Pippin and Merry are in the war.
Well, just a few more questions, Mr. Tolkien. How would you say fame has affected your life?
Well, as I'm sure you know, fame is not such a great thing. You're not allowed to go in public places without people recognizing you. So as later, I'm kind of recluse and stay in my home a lot.
I see. Well, now that you're retired, what do you find yourself doing with your time?
Well, right now, I'm just writing a little tiny bit here and there, and mostly staying with my wife as she's ill right now. I was very fortunate to come here. I want to visit the States when I get older, some other parts of the States, and some other travel extensively.
I see. Well, what are your plans for the future? Just the traveling?
Just the traveling, basically. And right now I'm at Oxford.
Oh, and you like your teaching position there? Is that what you have?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Tolkien. We're all out of time now, but we'll see you next week on the Phyllis Donahue Show. Goodbye.
I have to do the clapping.